Hello everyone and welcome back to another comic book video. My name's Michael and today we're going to be getting back into our history comics and we're going to be talking about the Copper Age. Now the Copper Age is actually a more recent addition to the timeline and history of comic books. It used to be the Bronze Age and then we're launched into what was considered the Modern Age. Whereas the Modern Age is stretched. As time gone on, the Modern Age is stretched. It was pretty much an addition to a new time period which pretty much covers the mid to late 80s. So when we talk about the Copper Age, we're talking about roughly about 84 to about 91, 92. There is some disagreement. Some kind of put the Copper Age as the entire 1980s. Other ones are more to this, what was like 84 to 91. Today I'm just going to go through the 84 to 91 because that's what's more considered the timeline for the Copper Age. So the reason why 1984 is kind of picked for the start of this is because that's when you started really seeing companies starting to do the major events. While major company-wide events are more common now, they were not for most of comic book history. But around 1984 is when you had DC starting to do its work on Crisis of Infinite Earths, and Marvel started its work on the first Secret Wars miniseries. So these were both company-wide events that had effects throughout the company lines. It caused relaunch of titles, major changes. For instance, Secret Wars, you had the origin and the introduction of Spider-Man's black costume. With Crisis of Infinite Earths, you had the death of Barry Allen. The Silver Age Flash, you also had a lot of the different Earths and the multiverse collapse in DC Comics from this time period. You also had some other major changes going on. It's also, not only is it called the Copper Age, it's also sometimes called the Dark Age of comics. You started seeing the storylines get a lot darker, more grittier, more adult. They were no longer more geared towards children, they were geared more towards adults. Some of the big storylines that came out from this time period is you had Watchmen, you had Batman The Dark Knight Returns, you had Batman Year One. These were just some of the stories that were very much darker, a darker tone, but they were also more psychological, showing that pretty much putting superheroes through very rough and challenging periods to see how that would affect them, being a superhero. You also had some other things going on. You had the expansion of comic lines. At the end of the 70s, a lot of the Marvel and DC actually started cutting some of their titles, but by the late 80s there was massive expansion. You had 4 or 5 different Spider-Man titles, you had massive expansion of the X-Men titles, you had more titles of Batman being added, so there was a lot of changes where the company lines were starting to do better, and so they were expanding their title offerings. You also started seeing really the introduction of variant covers at this time period. Usually it was just a traditional, just one cover for the comics, but now you're starting to see them doing different covers, gimmicks and stuff to try and improve sales. You started seeing the rise of what has become known as the speculators market. This was, for the longest time, comics were viewed more as something just to read for enjoyment, but with rise of speculators, it also came to a point where comics were being viewed also as an investment, a financial investment, where individuals could buy comics and then could resell them at a higher profit. A lot of this started coming about because you had fans who were starting to try and collect runs. They were looking to stuff from the Golden and Silver Age, which had a lot of times very few copies still in existence, so they were having to pay more to obtain these copies, giving rise to the idea that there's a lot of money to be made in comic books. So you really started seeing that. You're seeing the introduction of new comic book companies from this time period. Dark Horse got their start around this time period. You also started seeing the rise of what became known as the direct market. A lot of times in the early days, in the Golden, Silver, and even the early Bronze Age, comic books were actually sold like at convenience stores, or drug stores, or grocery stores, newspaper stands. But throughout the 80s, a lot of these places either started getting rid of comics or actually started shutting down. So what they would then, there was comic books were then starting to be sold to specialty shops. like comic book shops or hobby shops, places that one of their main things to sell was comic books. It wasn't just one small part of their big stock, it was what they mostly focused on. So you're starting to see the shift from newsstands to more of selling directly to comic shops. And so the Copper Age ran to about 91. A lot of times people consider the end of the Copper Age to be around when X-Men #1 launched by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee. This was about the height of the speculators market. It also starts but you also start seeing into the point where you start to see the downfall of the speculators market around, even while its height, it was starting to show cracks, and within the next year or two, the speculators market would collapse, and the comic book industry would just see a massive reduction in sales and number of titles, a lot of things as that market collapsed. But right now we're looking at comic books pretty much in the late 80s at its height. So, and I have a couple examples today. I have this is Batman 423. This is actually a second print, not a first print. But this would be considered what you would consider a classic cover. It's a Todd McFarlane cover. He had spent a very brief time working with DC before doing work for Marvel. Then eventually in the early 90s he would go on to help found Image Comics. But this is a classic cover. This is a cover he did just for this issue of Batman. Next we have an issue of Spider-Man. Now this is actually a nice minor key. This is the first appearance of Cletus Kasady is in this issue. For those who may not know, Cletus Kasady becomes the host for the Carnage symbiote. Of course, there's a new Venom movie that's going to be coming out in the very near future, and Carnage is supposed to be making an appearance, so also Cletus Kasady will probably make an appearance as well. You also have an appearance of a new vigilante called Cardiac in this issue as well. Next, I have an issue here of the Avengers. This is actually kind of an interesting little issue. It's an anniversary issue. It's issue 300. But also, this also has the introduction of Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman as members of the Avengers. You may not have realized that they were Avengers. It did not last very long. In fact, they were only with the team for a couple issues. This also took place during one of Marvel Comics' big events called Infernio, where pretty much you had a bunch of demons take over New York City. And the final issue I brought today is Wolverine #1. This is a nice key as well. This is the first issue of his first ongoing series. He did have a 4-issue miniseries that came out a couple years previously, but this is the first issue of his first ongoing series. Also, it's the introduction of his black costume, which he wears for a brief time in this series. So that's everything I have for today. I'll be back next week. We're going to start talking about the modern age. And since most of my collection is associated with the modern age, I'm actually breaking it up over a couple weeks. Next week, we're going to focus on the modern age, where we're going to specifically look at DC Comics. The week after that, we're going to look at Marvel. And the week after that, we're going to look at some of the other different companies and stuff as well. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and just give it a like. And I'll see you next week. Bye.